Widow reveals truth about husband. Steve Harvey falls silent. Some men live loud lives. They chase fame and fortune and recognition, and the world remembers them for what they accomplished. But some men live quiet lives, and the world never knows their name until someone stands up and tells the story that should have been told a long time ago. On a Thursday afternoon in August 2024, a 52-year-old widow from Baltimore stood on the Family Feud stage and told Steve Harvey the truth about her late husband. Not the version the neighbors knew, not the version that fit neatly into a eulogy. The real truth, the whole truth, the kind of truth that rewrites everything you thought you understood about a person. Steve Harvey, the man who had spent decades filling rooms with laughter and noise and energy, fell completely silent. He did not speak for so long that the producers nearly called for a break. He just stood there, looking at this woman, with tears rolling down his face and his mouth unable to form a single word. Because what she told him about her husband was so extraordinary, so selfless, and so quietly heroic that it made everything else that had ever happened on that stage feel small. Before we get into this story, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss moments like this. Stay to the very end, because the truth this woman revealed will change the way you think about the people in your own life. The Coleman family from Baltimore, Maryland walked onto the Family Feud stage with a quiet dignity that set them apart from the moment they appeared. They were not loud. They were not performing. They moved together with the unhurried closeness of a family that had been through something profound and had come out the other side still intact but permanently changed. Their matching shirts were navy blue, simple and understated, and each of them wore a small silver pin on their collar in the shape of a house. Nobody in the audience knew what the pin meant. By the end of the taping, that tiny silver house would represent one of the most remarkable acts of hidden generosity anyone had ever heard of. At the front of the family stood Grace Coleman. She was 52 years old, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Grace worked as a hospital billing administrator at Johns Hopkins, a job she had held for 19 years. She was the kind of woman who moved through the world with a steadiness that people instinctively trusted. When she spoke, her voice was warm but measured, each word placed carefully, as if she understood the weight that language carried and refused to waste a syllable. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, and she wore small gold earrings that had belonged to her mother. There was a sadness about Grace that she did not try to hide, but there was also something else, a purpose. She had come to this stage with something to say, and the calm in her eyes suggested she had been waiting for the right moment to say it. Grace's husband, Thomas Coleman, had died of a stroke 14 months earlier at the age of 54. Thomas had been a city bus driver for the Maryland Transit Administration for 28 years. He drove the number 27 route through some of the most underserved neighborhoods in East Baltimore, making the same loop day after day, year after year, through streets that most people drove past without a second glance. Thomas was not famous. He was not wealthy. He never held public office or appeared on television or did anything that would have put his name in a newspaper. He was, by every conventional measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But Grace knew better. Grace knew that her husband was the furthest thing from ordinary, and she had come to Family Feud to make sure the world knew it too. Standing next to Grace was her oldest child, her son Marcus, who was 28 and worked as a high school history teacher in Baltimore. Marcus had his father's build, tall and broad-shouldered, and his father's temperament, patient, steady, and inclined to listen before he spoke. Marcus had been the one to find Thomas on the kitchen floor the morning of the stroke. He had performed CPR until the paramedics arrived. It was not enough. Thomas died at the hospital 3 hours later. Marcus had not talked about that morning to anyone except his mother, and he carried the memory of it in the same quiet way his father had carried everything inside, where nobody could see it, where it could not burden the people he loved. Next to Marcus was Grace's daughter, Elise, who was 25 and worked as a social worker for the city of Baltimore. Elise was her mother's emotional echo, perceptive and empathetic, and attuned to the feelings of the people around her in a way that sometimes felt like a sixth sense. She had inherited her father's gentle nature and her mother's backbone, and the combination made her exceptionally good at her job, which involved working with families in crisis in neighborhoods that were not so different from the ones her father had driven through every day. The fourth member of the team was Grace's younger sister, Vivian, who was 48 and worked as a nurse practitioner at a community health clinic in West Baltimore. Vivian was the family's engine, the one who organized holidays and checked in on everyone and made sure that grief did not turn into isolation. She had been Grace's closest companion since Thomas's death, showing up at her sister's house every Thursday evening with takeout and a willingness to sit in silence or talk for hours, whatever Grace needed. Vivian had loved Thomas like a brother, and she was one of the few people outside the immediate family who knew pieces of what Grace was about to reveal. The fifth member of the team was a man named Walter Price. He was 61 years old, and he was not a member of the Coleman family. He was Thomas Coleman's best friend. Walter and Thomas had met on their first day as bus drivers for the MTA 30 years earlier, and they had been inseparable ever since. Walter was retired now, having left the transit authority 2 years before Thomas died. He was a quiet man with deep-set eyes and enormous hands that seemed made for hard work. Walter did not say much, but when he did, people listened, because Walter only spoke when he had something worth saying. Grace had asked Walter to be on the team because he was the only person alive who knew the full scope of what Thomas had done. He was the only person who had watched it happen from the beginning. And he was the only person who could confirm what Grace was about to tell the world, because the world was not going to believe it without a witness. The Coleman family was facing off against the Price family from Richmond, Virginia, no relation to Walter, which drew a small laugh from both sides before the game started. The Price family from Richmond was lively and fun, bringing good energy to the stage. Both families shook hands warmly. Steve Harvey came out and greeted everyone, spending extra time with Grace when she told him she was a widow. "I am sorry for your loss," Steve said with genuine warmth. Grace thanked him and said, "He would have loved being here. He watched you every single day after his shift." Steve smiled. "Then let us play this game for him." Grace looked at Steve with an expression that carried the quiet intensity of someone who was about to honor a promise and said, "That is exactly what I intend to do." The game started, and the Coleman family played with a methodical precision that reflected Grace's steady personality. There were no wild celebrations or theatrical reactions. They answered questions, scored points, and moved through each round with the calm efficiency of people who were not there to put on a show. They were there for something else. Marcus gave strong answers. Elise contributed cleverly. Vivian got a #1 response that earned warm applause. Even Walter, who admitted to Steve that he had never been on television before and was nervous enough to swallow my own tongue, managed to deliver a top-3 answer that made the audience cheer. Grace played well but sparingly, giving correct answers without elaboration and stepping back from the podium quickly each time. She was conserving her energy for something. Anyone paying close attention could see it. She was waiting. By the 4th round, the Colemans had a solid lead. The audience was enjoying the family, particularly Walter, whose dry humor and occasional one-liners had won them over completely. During one break, Steve asked Walter how he and Thomas had become friends. Walter thought about it and said, "First day on the job, Thomas gave me half his lunch because I forgot mine. I said, 'Man, you do not even know me.' He said, 'You are hungry, are you not?' That was Thomas. He did not need to know you to help you. He just needed to know you needed help." Steve nodded and smiled, but Grace's eyes had filled with tears because Walter had unknowingly summarized the very thing she had come to tell the world. Then came the question that opened the door. Steve read from his card. "We surveyed 100 people. Name something a wife might discover about her husband after he passes away." The question was designed to elicit answers like debts, secret hobbies, love letters, hidden purchases, things that were mildly surprising and perhaps slightly humorous. It was Grace's turn at the podium. She stepped up, and the energy around her changed. The steadiness that had defined her all day sharpened into something more focused, more deliberate. She looked at Steve, and instead of answering quickly the way she had all game, she paused. The pause lasted long enough for Steve to tilt his head slightly, reading her expression with the practiced eye of a man who had seen thousands of people stand at that podium, and who knew the difference between someone who was thinking of an answer and someone who was about to open a door they had been standing in front of for a long time. "Mr. Harvey," Grace said, "I would like to answer your question. But I would like to tell you the real answer, not the game show answer." Steve's expression shifted. He set his card down slightly, a barely perceptible lowering of his hand that signaled to the audience and the producers that something was happening. "Go ahead, Grace," he said. Grace took a breath. "When my husband Thomas died 14 months ago, I had to go through his things, his desk, his files, his closet, the boxes in the basement that he always told me were just old work papers." She paused. They were not old work papers. The studio was getting quieter. Grace continued. "In those boxes, I found records, receipts, letters, bank statements from a separate account I never knew about." She looked at Steve, and there was not a trace of anger or betrayal in her voice. There was wonder. "Mr. Harvey, my husband drove a city bus for 28 years. He made $47,000 a year. We lived modestly. We were comfortable but never extravagant. I always assumed that his paycheck and mine covered our bills, and that was that. We were a regular family with regular finances." Grace's voice steadied, growing stronger as she moved deeper into the story. What I found in those boxes was that for 22 years, my husband had been setting aside between $200 and $400 a month from his paycheck into a separate savings account. He did it by cutting his own expenses down to almost nothing. He packed the same lunch every day. He wore the same 3 pairs of work pants until they fell apart. He cut his own hair. He never bought himself anything, not a new watch, not new shoes, not a single luxury in 22 years. Steve was listening with his full body, his card forgotten, his posture angled toward Grace as if he was being pulled forward by the gravity of what she was saying. I found over $93,000 in that account, Mr. Harvey. $93,000 that a city bus driver saved over 22 years by denying himself everything. Grace's voice cracked for the first time, but she pushed through. But that is not the secret. The secret is what he did with the money. The audience was holding its breath. Marcus was standing behind his mother with his jaw set tight and his eyes glistening. Elise was holding Vivian's hand. Walter was looking at the floor, nodding slowly because he already knew what was coming. I found letters in those boxes, Grace said. Dozens of letters, letters from families in the neighborhoods along his bus route, families he had met during his daily runs. A woman whose son needed dental surgery and could not afford it. Thomas paid for it. A teenager who got accepted to community college but could not cover the registration fee. Thomas paid for it. An elderly man whose furnace broke in January and who was heating his apartment with his oven. Thomas bought him a new furnace and had it installed. Grace's tears were flowing now, but her voice held. There were 47 letters in those boxes, Mr. Harvey, 47 families. Over 22 years, my husband used that separate account to help 47 families along his bus route. He paid rent for people who were about to be evicted. He bought groceries for families who were hungry. He paid electric bills so children would not sit in the dark. He bought school supplies and winter coats and medicine. She stopped for a moment and wiped her eyes. The studio was silent in the way that studios go silent when 200 people simultaneously stop breathing. Not one of those families knew it was him. He did everything anonymously. He would leave envelopes with cash at people's doors. He would pay bills over the phone using a fake name. He would ask Walter to drop things off so nobody would connect it back to him. All eyes turned to Walter. The 61-year-old retired bus driver was crying silently, his massive hands folded in his lap, nodding as Grace spoke. "That is true," Walter said, his deep voice rough with emotion. "I was his delivery man. He would hand me an envelope and say, 'Walter, the lady on North Avenue needs this. Do not tell her it is from me.' And I would deliver it every single time for 22 years. Grace turned back to Steve. "My husband never told me. In 26 years of marriage, he never once mentioned what he was doing. He let me think we were living paycheck to paycheck because he was giving everything he could to strangers, not strangers, his people, the people on his route, the people he saw every day from behind the wheel of that bus. He watched them get on and off and he learned their lives, and when they were struggling, he helped, quietly, without credit, without recognition, for 22 years. Steve Harvey had not moved. He had not spoken. He was standing behind his podium with his card at his side, his mouth slightly open and tears running down his face in steady, unbroken lines. The man who always had something to say, who could fill any silence with humor or wisdom or warmth, had nothing. He was empty. The story had reached inside him and taken every word he had. The silence lasted 8 seconds, then 10, then 15. The producers later said they considered cutting to commercial, but something about Steve's stillness told them not to. This silence was not a problem to be solved. It was the only appropriate response to what had just been said. When Steve Harvey finally spoke, his voice was different from anything the audience had heard from him in over a decade of hosting. It was thin and raw and stripped of everything except the truth of what he was feeling. He did not try to compose himself. He did not try to project strength or wisdom. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have just been shown something that fundamentally changes their understanding of what a human being can be. "Grace," Steve said, and then he stopped. He pressed his fingers against his eyes and took a breath that shuddered on the way in. "Grace, I need a minute." He held up his hand to the audience, not for applause or silence, but for patience. He needed a minute, and the audience gave it to him, sitting in a stillness that felt almost sacred. When he continued, his words came slowly, chosen with the care of a man who understood that this moment deserved his very best. "In my career, I have met men who have built skyscrapers. I have met men who have run companies and led countries and changed the course of history. And I have stood on stages and called them great. But I have never in my entire life heard of a man as great as Thomas Coleman." The audience began to react, but Steve raised his hand again. He was not finished. "This man drove a bus. He made $47,000 a year, and he took a piece of that money every single month for 22 years and gave it to people who were struggling, people he did not know personally, people who rode his bus. People who had no idea that the man behind the wheel was watching them, learning their lives, and quietly making sure they survived. He never told his wife. He never told his children. He never told a soul except Walter, and only because he needed someone to deliver the envelopes. Steve looked at Grace. "Your husband was a great man, and I need you to hear me say that because I know the world never told him. The world does not hand out awards to bus drivers who skip lunch for 22 years so they can buy somebody's kid a winter coat. But it should. God help us, it should." The audience broke. The applause that followed was not the sharp, punctuated applause of a game show moment. It was the deep, sustained sound of 200 people expressing something that applause was not designed to carry. Grief, admiration, shame, gratitude. The sound rolled through the studio and did not stop for nearly 2 minutes. Marcus stepped forward. He had been silent through his mother's entire revelation, standing behind her the way his father had taught him to stand behind the people he loved, present and supportive and steady. But now he spoke, and his voice carried the same measured quality as his father's had. "I want people to know something about my dad. He was not a saint. He was not some perfect, untouchable figure. He got tired. He got frustrated. He complained about traffic and weather and the Orioles like every other man in Baltimore. He was human. But he had this thing inside him, this belief that if you could help, you should. Not might, not could, should. It was not optional for him. It was as automatic as breathing. And he did not want us to know because he was afraid we would try to talk him out of it. He knew we would say, 'Dad, we need that money. Keep it.' And he did not want to hear that because he knew that the people on his route needed it more." Elise spoke next, tears streaming down her face. "I am a social worker. I spend every day trying to help families in neighborhoods just like the ones my father drove through. And I did not know until he died that my father had been doing the same work I do, except he was doing it with his own money, on his own time, without a degree or a title or a salary for it. He was just a man on a bus who cared. I became a social worker because I wanted to help people. I did not realize until 14 months ago that I became one because my father had already shown me what helping looked like." Walter stood up from his spot at the end of the podium. He was a man of few words, but the words he chose landed like stones. "Thomas Coleman was the best man I ever knew. And the hardest part was watching him give everything away and never take credit for any of it. I asked him once, I said, 'Thomas, why do you not tell Grace? Why do you not tell your kids?' And he said, 'Because the moment I tell somebody, it stops being about them and starts being about me. And it was never about me.' That is who he was, the most generous man in Baltimore, and he wanted to be invisible." Steve Harvey wiped his face with both hands and took a long breath. Then he made the announcement that had been building inside him since Grace first started speaking. "The Coleman family is going to win this game today. That is already decided in my heart. But I am going to do something else. I am going to make sure Thomas Coleman's name is known. I am going to make sure that the man who drove the number 27 bus through East Baltimore for 28 years and quietly helped 47 families gets the recognition he refused to ask for while he was alive." Steve announced that his foundation would be establishing the Thomas Coleman Community Fund, a permanent charitable fund based in Baltimore that would continue the work Thomas had been doing anonymously for 2 decades. The fund would provide emergency financial assistance to families along the bus routes of East Baltimore, the same neighborhoods Thomas had served. Steve committed an initial $100,000 and pledged to raise more. "This man saved $93,000 on a bus driver's salary and gave every penny of it away," Steve said. "If I cannot match his generosity with my resources, then I have no business standing on this stage." Grace stood at the podium and cried the kind of tears that come when something you have been carrying alone is finally shared with the world. "Thomas," she said softly, speaking to a man who was not there but whose presence filled every corner of that studio. "They know now, baby. Everybody knows. The Coleman family played fast money and won the $20,000. Grace donated the entire amount to the Thomas Coleman Community Fund before she left the studio. When the producers asked her if she was sure, she said, 'That is what Thomas would have done. He would not have kept a penny.' It was not a performance. It was not a grand gesture. It was simply who the Coleman family was, because Thomas had taught them, without ever saying a word, that money meant nothing if it was not being used to lift someone up. When the episode aired 7 weeks later, the clip of Grace revealing Thomas's secret became the most shared piece of content on the internet for 4 consecutive days. It was viewed over 100 million times across all platforms within 2 weeks. It was translated into over 40 languages. News outlets on every continent covered the story. But the numbers, as staggering as they were, told only the smallest part of what happened next. The 47 families that Thomas had helped over 22 years began to come forward. One by one, people from the neighborhoods along the number 27 bus route saw the episode and realized that the anonymous envelopes, the mysteriously paid bills, the winter coats that appeared on their doorsteps, had all come from the same man. The bus driver, the quiet man who said good morning to them every day and never asked for anything in return. A woman named Patricia Hayes was the first to come forward publicly. She had received an anonymous envelope in 2011 containing exactly enough money to cover 3 months of rent that she owed after losing her job. The envelope had saved her and her 2 children from eviction. She had spent 12 years wondering who had sent it. When she watched the Family Feud episode and heard Grace describe the envelopes and the anonymous payments, Patricia sat in her living room and wept for an hour. She told a local reporter, "I rode that bus every morning. I said good morning to Thomas Coleman 5 days a week for years. He knew I was struggling because one morning I got on the bus crying and he asked me what was wrong. I told him I was about to lose my apartment. He just nodded and said, 'Things have a way of working out.' 3 days later, the envelope was under my door. I never connected it to him, not once. He was just the bus driver who said good morning." The stories poured in. A retired school janitor who received money for his wife's cancer medication. A young mother who found an envelope with enough cash to repair her car so she could get to work. A teenage boy whose college application fee was paid anonymously, enabling him to apply to the university where he eventually earned his degree. Each story followed the same pattern. A person in need. A conversation on the bus. Thomas listening, nodding, saying little. And then, days later, the help arriving without a name attached to it. The Thomas Coleman Community Fund exceeded $1 million in donations within the first month after the episode aired. Contributions came from every state and from 38 countries. Bus drivers across the country organized fundraisers and donated collectively, saying that Thomas had represented the best of their profession. The Maryland Transit Administration renamed the number 27 route the Thomas Coleman line, and a small plaque was installed on the bus that read, "In memory of Thomas Coleman, who drove this route for 28 years and quietly changed 47 lives. He asked for nothing. He gave everything." Steve Harvey devoted an entire episode of his talk show to the Thomas Coleman story. He brought Grace and the family onto the set, and he also invited several of the 47 families who had been helped by Thomas to sit in the audience. When Grace walked onto the stage and saw the people her husband had helped, many of whom she had never met, she stopped in her tracks. She looked at their faces, the faces of strangers who owed something profound to a man they had known only as the driver of the 27 bus, and she pressed her hands to her chest and stood there for a long moment, absorbing the reality of what her husband had built in secret. Steve sat down with Grace and asked her the question that millions of people had been asking since the episode aired. "Grace, are you angry that he kept this from you for 22 years? Grace considered the question with the same careful deliberation she brought to everything. "I was at first," she said. "When I found those boxes, I felt betrayed, not because he had been giving money away, but because he had hidden such a fundamental part of himself from me. I thought I knew everything about my husband. I thought we had a marriage without secrets. And then I discovered that the biggest secret he kept was that he was even better than I thought he was." She paused. "How do you stay angry at a man for being too good? You cannot. So instead, I decided to make sure the world knew what he did, because Thomas wanted to be invisible, but I think he earned the right to be seen." Marcus gave an interview separately in which he revealed something that had not been part of the Family Feud segment. He said that after Thomas's death, he had gone back through his father's route and visited as many of the 47 families as he could find. He said that in nearly every home, there was some small evidence of Thomas's impact. A child who had stayed in school because of a paid fee, a family that had stayed in their apartment because of covered rent, a grandmother who was still alive because Thomas had paid for medication she could not afford. "My father's legacy is not in a bank account or a building with his name on it," Marcus said. "His legacy is in the lives of people who are still here because he noticed them and decided to help. That is the kind of legacy that does not need a monument. It is already alive." The story of Thomas Coleman inspired a national movement. Organizations and community groups launched programs modeled on what Thomas had done, small-scale, anonymous giving targeted at people in immediate need within specific neighborhoods. The model became known as route giving, a reference to Thomas's bus route, and it spread to over 200 cities within a year. The concept was simple and powerful. Find the people who are struggling in your immediate community. Help them. Do not tell anyone, just help. Walter Price, Thomas's best friend and the man who had delivered envelopes for 2 decades, was interviewed by a national magazine. The reporter asked Walter what he wanted people to remember about Thomas. Walter sat quietly for a moment, his enormous hands resting on his knees, and then he said, "Thomas used to say something to me every time he handed me an envelope. He would say, 'Walter, you and I are the only ones who know about this, and that is exactly how many people need to know.' And I would say, 'Thomas, what you are doing matters, people should know.' And he would shake his head and say, 'What matters is that they eat tonight. What matters is that the heat stays on. What matters is that the kid goes to school. Whether they know my name does not change any of that.'" Walter paused. That was the kind of man he was. He measured his life not by what he had but by what he could give. And he gave everything he had, quietly, completely, without expecting a single thing in return. 2 years after the Family Feud episode aired, the city of Baltimore held a ceremony dedicating a community center in Thomas Coleman's name in the East Baltimore neighborhood he had served for nearly 3 decades. Grace, Marcus, Elise, Vivian, and Walter all attended, along with over 500 community members, many of them families Thomas had helped. The mayor spoke. City council members spoke. The head of the MTA spoke. But the most powerful moment came when Grace stood at the podium inside the center that bore her husband's name and addressed the crowd. "Thomas would not have wanted this building named after him," Grace said, and the crowd laughed gently because they knew it was true. He would have said it was too much attention. He would have said, "Grace, just let me drive my bus." But Thomas is not here to argue with me anymore, so I am going to say what needs to be said. She looked out at the hundreds of faces watching her. "My husband was not a hero in the way the world usually defines heroes. He did not save lives in a dramatic, visible way. He saved lives in the smallest, quietest, most invisible way possible. $100 here, a paid bill there. A winter coat left on a doorstep. He saved lives one envelope at a time, and he did it for 22 years without telling a soul. That is not ordinary generosity. That is a life devoted to the belief that every single person you encounter deserves dignity, and that if you have even a little bit to give, you give it." Grace paused and touched the silver house pin on her collar, the same pin the family had worn on the Family Feud stage. "These pins are shaped like a house because Thomas believed that home was not just a building, it was a feeling. And he spent his life trying to make sure that the people on his route felt that feeling. Safe, warm, seen. He could not give them mansions, but he could give them one more month in their apartment. He could give them one more winter with the heat on. He could give them the knowledge, even if they never knew where it came from, that somebody in this world cared whether they were okay." She looked up and her eyes were clear and her voice was steady. "Steve Harvey asked me on that stage if I was angry that Thomas kept his secret. I told him no. And that is the truth. I am not angry. I am in awe. I was married to a man who gave away nearly everything he earned for 22 years and never once asked to be thanked for it. I did not know I was married to a great man. I thought I was married to a bus driver. Turns out I was married to both." Steve Harvey, who had flown to Baltimore for the ceremony, stood in the back of the room and listened to Grace's speech without saying a word. When it was over, he did not take the microphone. He did not make a speech. He walked to the front of the room, placed his hand on the plaque that bore Thomas Coleman's name, closed his eyes for a moment, and then walked to Grace and embraced her. It was the same silence he had shown on the Family Feud stage, the silence of a man who understood that some truths were too big for words, and that the most respectful thing you could do in the presence of real greatness was to simply stand still and let it wash over you. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Leave a comment below and tell us about someone in your life who gives without asking for credit. Share this video with everyone you know, because Thomas Coleman's story is proof that the most extraordinary people are often the ones the world never notices. We will see you in the next one.